Apollo 16 was one of the most difficult and challenging missions that we had ever tried from a technical perspective and from their landing site. The Saturn V for Apollo 16 had to be rolled, after it was rolled out to the pad, it had to be rolled back in again because they discovered a problem with the gimbal on the service module engine. The gimbal is the part, if you imagine that my hand is the engine, the gimbal is the part that swivels the engine, that turns it, and we use this to steer while we're doing rocket burns. This SPS engine is the one that gets us into and then out of lunar orbit, and obviously if you can't gimbal it, you've got some serious problems on your hands. So we had to roll the thing back, replace this engine, then roll it out just in time for a hurricane to hit Cape Canaveral. And so we were not ready to launch Apollo 16 until April of 1972. Their landing site was the most dangerous of them all. The only mission to land in the heavily mountainous and heavily cratered lunar highlands at a place on the moon called the Descartes Mountains. Now, NASA wanted a great pilot and a great commander for Apollo 16, and the man who gets the job is Gemini veteran and past trip to the moon guy, John Young. He had been to the moon before on Apollo 10 as command module pilot, and now he would be going and walking on the moon as commander of Apollo 16. His crew was Charlie Duke, who would be walking on the lunar surface with him, and Ken Mattingly, the original command module pilot for Apollo 13 before he was felled by measles. And they launched towards their landing site on April 16th, 1972. And off they went. As they were going towards the moon, they started to get problems with their gimbal again as they're going into lunar orbit. So it was decided that we would take Apollo 16 home one day early. Normally after they returned from the moon, the entire crew would spend one day in lunar orbit taking photographs for future landing missions, in Apollo 16's case just for Apollo 17. But we decided to scrub that day and get them home as quickly as possible so that this engine didn't have enough time to completely fail. But anyway, into lunar orbit they went, and Charlie Duke and John Young climbed into their lunar module Orion and set off towards the Descartes Mountains. We want to see if the moon has active volcanoes, because whether or not it does, either instance will give us valuable insight into some of the features that we see on the moon, whether or not they are completely made up by impact or far distant past volcanic eruptions. So this heavily mountainous area seems the perfect opportunity to test this lunar volcanism theory. And contrary to the immense challenge that presented John Young in landing Orion in the Descartes Mountains, he did it perfectly. An amazing landing was the one that John Young gave to Apollo 16, right on their landing site, straight as a dime. And they got out, deployed their lunar rover, deployed their experiments packages, and then set off in the rover towards their first objective. Over the course of 3 EVAs, Duke and Young drive the rover hard for more than 17 miles over rugged terrain. They use it to bring back a record 209 pounds of moon rocks. And as they're driving along, it was the first time that we had the lunar rover at 100% health. On Apollo 15 the front axle broke, so we didn't have any steering in the front wheels, and this was the first time that the lunar rover was working perfectly. But one of the things that John Young felt a little bit bad about is that it seemed that every few minutes he had to say, "Charlie, don't bump my arm," because they were sitting right next to each other, and every time Charlie moved his wrist, he would bump John Young's arm and move the steering wheel. It's not a good thing when you're steering for big blocks. And there had been a small change in the design of their fenders for Apollo 16, and it was not the best because they had made the fenders too thin, and the lunar dust just came right up over their heads and dropped down on them. And Charlie Duke said, "It's raining, John," and this stuff was falling on them like rain. And after a half of a spacewalk, their white suits turned grey. Not the great thing when you want to keep all of your equipment and experiments clean, especially when this thing's camera runs on solar power. Anyway, they fix up their 3 EVAs, proving that the moon doesn't indeed have volcanoes, and that everything on the moon is created by volcanism. And they park the lunar rover at the landing site and use its TV camera to document Apollo 16 blasting off from the lunar surface back to a successful rendezvous with their with their command module Casper just a few hours later. A wonderful moment on Apollo 16 happened when they were doing their Trans-Earth EVA. Exactly the same as Apollo 15, they did a spacewalk in between the moon and the Earth to retrieve their experiments packages on the Cerberus module. Ken Mattingly, just before they left on the mission, had gotten married, so he was a newlywed going up. And as they were getting ready to come home, Ken Mattingly suddenly realised that he couldn't find his wedding ring. It had gotten off his finger, and Charlie Duke said, "Did you try inside your glove?" Ken says, "Yeah, it's not there." And John Young, who was a recent divorcee, said it's not NASA approved equipment for space travel. So not very much sympathy from John Young. But Charlie Duke tried his best to help Ken find it, and they just couldn't do it. And Ken Mattingly was the one who had to go outside on this spacewalk to retrieve these cassettes, and Charlie Duke was the guy responsible for keeping him safe, keeping him attached to the spacecraft. And as he was looking out for Ken Mattingly, above him he noticed movement, and he noticed a little twinkle, and he looked up, and floating towards the open hatch of the command module was this golden ring. And he tried to grab it, but it snugged on his glove and pinged out of his hands out of the hatch. Now, amazingly, it should have been lost forever. But it actually bounced off of Ken Mattingly's helmet into the hatchway, bounced off the side of the hatch, and hit Charlie Duke in the visor, hit his visor, and just suddenly, and then he grabbed it as quickly as he could and put it in his pocket pouch. And when Ken came back in after the spacewalk, he said, "Hey Ken, I got something for you." And he said, "What you got?" He says, "A ring." Ken go, getting his wedding ring back, and lovely little moment for Apollo 16. And the next moon mission would be our last.